I fully agree. I think one reason why people might sometimes be inclined to think differently is that, in a sense, because we all want to be responsible. So in a sense, it would sound strange to us that in order to be responsible, you need you need these special competences. But I think this is just a difference between being responsible in the sense of being committed to certain values or certain moral principles, and being responsible in how you, for example, exercise innovation or how you lead your company. In order to do it in detail in the innovation process really requires expertise. Like you say, for accountancy, you need financial, and for marketing and for technical innovation, for all these things, you need expertise. And this is actually also true if you really want to do all the details of responsible. So really translates this commitment to the good into something you're doing on the ground, so to say, in your company.
Hi there, and welcome to Future Up Close. Here we explore the topic of responsible innovation. Today we have Professor Dr. Ivo van der Poel from the Netherlands. So Ivo is a full professor in ethics and technology at TU Delft. He has published a diverse range of books and journal articles covering engineering ethics, design for values, responsible innovation, and much more. For 3 years, from 2016 to 2019, he also led a Horizon 2020 project called PRISMA, where he worked with 8 businesses to integrate responsible innovation into daily business innovation activities. So today we will talk about PRISMA, and in particular how we can translate the learnings from PRISMA to other businesses. So first of all, welcome to the program, Ivo.
Thank you.
Shall we start?
Yeah.
What was PRISMA for? How did it come about, and what did it involve?
Yeah. So, like you said, PRISMA was an Horizon 2020 project. Horizon 2020 is the big funding scheme of the European Union, and we applied for it. So we applied for a grant which was about incentivizing responsible innovation in the industry. And what we did in the PRISMA project is we did, like you already said, 8 pilots with 8 companies from different European countries, from the Netherlands, from the UK, from Italy. And we did kind of we practiced with them responsible innovation, and we developed them into examples or good practices, as we called them. And in addition to that, we developed things like a toolkit, a roadmap tool, KPIs, key performance indicators. So all kinds of tools that companies can use to do responsible innovation.
Because they are quite diverse, different companies.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what were the key learnings from the project?
Yeah. So like you said, they're very different companies. So some were really small, like startup companies. But also some of the Italian companies were quite big and part of a multinational. So it's quite diverse. To be honest, most of these companies hadn't heard of responsible innovation. So they were doing things like corporate social responsibility. They were thinking about values. So they took their social responsibility seriously, but it didn't really know notion of responsible innovation. And what we found out was the best way to introduce it to them is first telling them that responsible innovation is, in a sense, simply something like corporate social responsibility applied to the innovation process. But in terms of implementing, one thing that worked quite well is actually starting with what these companies were already doing, and then adding elements to it. So for example, some of these companies, for example, do already risk assessments, or they do life cycle assessments. And some of these issues there are very similar to the issues you address in responsible innovation. But we found out, for example, in the case of life cycle analysis, what happened is that they first developed the product and then they did a life cycle analysis at the stage you couldn't change the product anymore. So one simple thing they could do better is doing this life cycle analysis earlier on in the process, so that it can actually feed into to the innovation process. And similarly for risk assessment, you might want to look at financial risk, but you might also want to look at a broader range of societal risks. So I think one of the main lessons for us was that actually we shouldn't have too much of an ideal what responsible innovation should be for these companies, but to discuss it with them and to start with what they're doing and to see how you can add easily elements to that to do more responsible innovation, so to say.
Just imagining a project happening right now.
Yeah.
How did you prepare before you went and approach different companies?
Yeah. So what we did is well, we had a consortium of different partners from the EU, and some like the people in Delft, we do already a long time responsible innovation. So we knew quite a bit about responsible innovation, at least on a theoretical level. So we knew what the idea was. We also knew quite a bit of tools that are available. But of course, it is something different to know it theoretically and to do it in a company. So I think for us, one of the challenges was just to find companies willing to do this. And yeah, sometimes, and that was interesting. So one of the things that was interesting about that is that what, for example, happened, we had one company very interested, but then the company was taken over by another company, and then they quitted the project because during the takeover there were so many issues. So one thing that you learn as an academic is that, say, the dynamics and the fluidity of business life is really different than what you're used to at the university. So things might change from day to day. So this is one of the things we had to. Another thing is that we found out that working with these companies, it was really important that we had commitment of somebody higher up in the company. So in some cases, we had even the CEO committed to the project. I think this is generally true. If you want to do responsible innovation, has to be something of the entire company. So that's also something we found out. And then the thing that I already said is work. So I think some of us had a very idealistic idea of what responsible innovation was, and we just thought, well, we just tell them and they will do it. But that's of course, and that makes perfect sense. I mean, so one of the things we learned is that we really should go along with to some extent the reality of the business world, but at the same time trying to add elements of responsible innovation. And I think in that sense was a nice learning process for us, but also for the companies, because they learned a lot of new things. But actually, they also found out that some things were maybe more easy than they thought to do in terms of responsible innovation.
What was the biggest gap between theory and practice for you?
I think maybe the biggest gap was that I said it already a bit. Is that at least many people doing more research or academic work on responsible innovation, they start from a kind of ideal picture of what responsible innovation is. So you have these theories. Responsible innovation has 4 pillars. It has to be anticipatory. It has to be engagement or dialogue. It has to be reflexive. You have to think about your values and your norms, and it has to be responsive. And that makes very much. But what I noted is that at least certainly some academics in the project very much had a kind of top-down idea. So you start with these pillars, make sure that all these things are being done in a company, and then. But that is simply not how it works. So my experience was that. So I worked myself with one of the Dutch companies called Spectro, which is a small family company. They're making detergents. And actually what worked best is just visiting this person, just spending a day, going there, talking what they were doing, talking about what maybe already were kind of dilemmas or issues for them. So very much starting from their reality. And of course, I mean, because I have this background, I see all kinds of issues this person didn't see. And this was a very nice and useful exchange. So I think the biggest gap was between kind of, say, idealized picture of what responsible innovation was, what we as academics tend to have, and to think well, if they don't do everything, it is not good enough. While much more, say, piecemeal, starting from the actual realities of businesses, and they're finding first issues that are relevant, but second also in a practical sense. So of course, business realities does not always allow to do good, or there might be constraints. But the interesting thing is, if you talk to people and you're creative, you can find ways to do responsible innovation. So I think there was for me the biggest gap between theory and practice, that we really needed to start with what was important for the companies, without, of course, forgetting what responsible innovation is. Yeah.
Do you find that's also part of building rapid and relationship and trust? It's really important before you begin.
And I think one of the things that I learned, and this is also a bit also in terms of the out. So I think what we try to do and still want, we made a nice website. So one of the ideas was, well, we just make tools and then people can start to do it themselves. And I think there are certainly things that people can start to do themselves. But I also found out that it is very much about indeed building a relation. And this is also interesting, I found out that I have much more tacit expertise than I realized myself about responsible innovation in these conversations. So I also found out that just giving them a tool or just telling them this is responsible innovation is not enough. You need this conversation, so to say, from both sides. So I need to understand what's going on in the company, and they need to understand what is responsible innovation. So one of the things that for me was also a lesson is that starting might require doing some consultancy or at least some conversation. And again, it doesn't mean that so we have nice tools and then companies can start to do things themselves. But I think to do it really well, you need some form of, you need somebody who is able to understand what's happening in the company and at the same time understand what responsible innovation is. Otherwise, it's very hard to do it in a serious way. So that was also for me a lesson. Yeah.
It sounds like part of it is building relationship and trust, and the other side is also about raising awareness and education, because responsible innovation is so new. So partially, I guess, from a business perspective, is they need to understand, why am I doing this thing? How is it going to help me to do things better? Right?
I think there are actually a whole range of potential advantages. And it goes from, so one thing is what sometimes is called license to operate. So license to operate means that you show you take serious a number of this can be regulatory issues, but in the case of responsible innovation, also more ethical and social issues. And the idea of license to operate is that you show as a company you take this seriously, and you have less chances of government intervention, and you have less problems with acceptability by the public or by your users of your product. So this is one thing, but it goes much further, I think. So one thing, I think, if you take really responsible innovation seriously, it is about thinking about, well, what do I want to do as a company? What do I want to deliver, not only commercially but also to society? And where do I see my place also as a business? And in that sense, it very much helps to what you might call strategic planning, which companies are doing anyway. But I think responsible innovation really adds a dimension to strategic planning, namely looking broader, looking at the whole of society, which actually is also, I think, in the end, in the commercial interest of the company. And a related thing is this, that responsible innovation might lead to new unsort of innovation. So you might come with new products you never thought of, because innovation is, you begin to realize that innovation is not just a technical process and not just requires technical knowledge, but also requires insight in what is important in society. And interestingly, this might also deliver you new products or services. So interestingly, so one of the companies we worked with is called HEAD. It means Hub of All Things. It's like a small company. It started off from research, and they actually came with a quite innovative product, which actually came from values like privacy and data governance. So they build a kind of environment that allow users of internet services or services on the net from companies to be in control of their own data. So the data are stored in a safe environment of these people, and these people can themselves decide with which companies they want to share the data. They can also decide to sell these data to companies, but they always in control. So they have a kind of individual dashboard in which the individuals can decide. So this is the idea. Sometimes it's called informed consent and privacy. So this is a very innovative product which has market potential, but probably you would never have come to this product, to this innovation, if you hadn't thought of social values. So I think this is also really an added value that it might bring, kind of new innovative products and new market niche or also profit possibilities as a company. So I think this is, so it ranges from just, in a sense, just doing what you should do, so to say, with you, to being strategic and innovative in ways that you wouldn't otherwise be. So it is not just making sure that you not get criticized, it's also creating new opportunities. And I think that is really nice about responsible innovation, that it is, in a sense, creates new opportunities, also new business opportunities for companies.
Knowing all the things you've gone through with the pilot projects, would you do anything differently?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would, but we also did make sure that I know enough of the company beforehand, so that I know what the business is they in, what are potential ethical issues in this business, or what are points of discussion. So I would make sure that I come there with enough information. And I would, like I said, very much start with having a conversation with these people to see what they concerned about, to see what are and maybe one thing that also would be a bit different is that compared to what we did in the PRISMA, we also very much wanted to do these pilots. So to be honest, we also had a bit of a short-term focus, because we wanted to show just a nice case, because this was also part of the project. We wanted to show that. So I would maybe even more than now from the start think about, okay, what could be, if I help them or talk to them, what could be the long-term effects of my intervention or my being involved. So how can we make sure that this is not just now something nice we found out, but something that stays in the company and becomes part of so I probably would pay a bit more attention to this long-term thing, so to say. Yeah.
That totally makes sense, because if we think about, for example, the journey of some of the large social media companies, it took a while for the impact to come through. So it would be quite interesting to actually see if, say, the philosophy of or application of responsible innovation, if that was integrated into their business model from earlier, would that have changed anything, or would it have been overridden by maybe other interests in the company, in the market economy, and in the commercial business? We have a variety of different capability pillars.
Yeah.
So in a responsible innovation-fied company, would those pillars be a little bit different? What would they be?
Yeah. So if you talk about the capabilities that are required so I've already said earlier in the theory about responsible innovation, people usually distinguish four main pillars, and I actually think these four pillars nicely correlate to capabilities that are needed for responsible innovation. So also needed. So let me give these four main. So the first pillar is usually called anticipation, and with anticipation we mean the ability to think about the future, But is not so much the ability to predict the future, because that's very likely we're not able to predict it, but it's more the ability actually to think in terms of possible scenarios that might happen in the future. And then in the case of responsible innovation, it is particularly not so much to anticipate, say, future prices or business developments, but future societal developments. Something might happen, or perhaps maybe something happens with your product so that people don't like it anymore, or a risk materializes. So it is also thinking about possible scenarios, including maybe not so positive ones that might happen with your product. And then, of course, doing something with that. So that's the first. So so it has to do with being imaginary, but can also just spending time and manpower on making scenarios, things like that. So that's the first pillar. That's called anticipation. The second pillar is usually called inclusion or engagement, and that pillar is very much about reaching out to a broad audience. And typically in responsible innovation, this is not just your direct clients and users and your shareholders, but a very broad range of stakeholders. So that can be members of the public, it can be governments, it can be NGOs. So this is very much about having a dialogue with these people. It can take different forms. So it can take dialogue. It can even go as far as what's called a co-design or participatory design, that you actually involve these people in your design process. Of course, depends on the company whether you can do that. But this is say related to capabilities of dialogue, of engagement, and so on. So that's the second main pillar. Then the third pillar is called reflexivity, and that's maybe sounds a bit complicated, but the idea of reflexivity is that you're able to articulate what your norms and values and your goals are. So reflexivity is very much about being able to say as a company, not just how do I want to make profit, but how do I want to create what's sometimes called shared value with society. So how I'm creating a product that is in the end maybe not just good for me and my company, but for the whole of society. And to be articulate about what goals, what values you're reasoning from, and of course not just to put them nicely on the website, but also in a way to have that through your entire organization. So that's what reflexivity is about. And the fourth one is called responsiveness. And responsiveness basically means the ability to respond to societal developments, including unexpected. So on the one hand, it relates a bit to things like I said, the inclusivity and the dialogue, picking up signals from society, but it also means the ability. So things like agility are part of that. So being able to maneuver, being able to change things in response to things in society. So these are the four main. I would actually say, so these capabilities are important for all companies, but I think in practice, some companies, so I think typically what you see is that bigger companies are usually better in anticipation, but less good in responsiveness, because they cannot quickly answer always to new developments. While, for example, startups usually wouldn't do so much anticipation simply because they don't have enough people to do anticipation, but they might be much more responsive. So they might be able to quickly answer if an issue comes up. So I think all four are important, but the relative importance also depends a bit on the type of company.
Then that leads to a question of then how do, say, a small startup can think about measuring in their starting point and how can they improve over time versus a big company in terms of how they measure and improve over time. So if I was a small company, only 5 people working, then what would be a reasonable level of responsible innovationness for them to reach versus a big company?
I think maybe the difference is not so much the level of overall responsible innovation, but the type of activities you do to do responsible innovation. So I would say for a small company, so I think, so we work, for example, with a small drone company. And for them, doing extensive anticipation in making terms of scenarios, of course, it's not possible with 5 people. But typically, they had problems with the acceptance of the drone because they wanted to make a drone that was to fly in living areas that was not allowed by regulation. And it was very clear that in order to get it allowed in regulation, they had to show some societal value, because then regulators might be convinced to allow it. So in this case, there was a very natural connection between doing responsible innovation and what they had to do anyway to make the product fly, literally, because otherwise it wouldn't simply be allowed. So I would say, in the case of smaller companies, it might be very much about thinking how the product you're making might be a responsible product and might add something to society, so to say, and might even, I think this was also the head case that I discussed, hub of all things case, in which actually the responsibility created a kind of niche market for them. And in such cases, this is very direct connection between what the company has to do anyway to get successful and responsible innovation. Now, if you talk about a big company on the other side, and we also had some, so we had Colorabia, which was more a big company of a large. There you see that responsible innovation translates much more in terms of all kinds of also formal procedures. So in terms of risk assessment, in terms of how they talk to users, they decided to involve users and regulators more early on in their product development. So in a sense, it might seem that they did more responsible innovation in terms that they did much more activities. But at the same time, these activities were a bit farther away from the core product because that was going on to some extent as it was, which is maybe just fine. So I don't think you can say that the one did more they simply did it in a somewhat other way. So in the big company, much more in terms of anticipation, in terms of formal procedures. In the small company, very much, I would even say at the core of the business proposition. And that is maybe also possible in big companies, but there it will take, of course, years and a very committed CEO to make it part of the business. I think there's some, for example, Unilever tried to do this to some extent, I think, to make, say, responsibility more a core part of the business proposition. But that also might sometimes be hard in terms of short-term profit. I mean, I think Unilever had some issues with the shareholders, for example. So also where the room is to change things is really different. First of all, for small, it's also different between different industries. So that's also what very much we saw in the project. So it might be really different in information and communication technology than in nanotechnology or than in medicine. So I think, yeah, I hope this answers the question.
So you mentioned living labs and lead users, and this, would you mind explaining to the listeners, if they don't know what these are, how can we set those things up?
Yeah, so the idea of living lab and lead, and this is particularly relevant in, so for example, for the drone company, this was really particularly relevant. So it's particularly relevant for new technologies in which there's not so much experience. And then a living lab is a kind of environment. It can be a part of society. It can also be literally on private terrain, but it can also be just in a city. Of course, you need approval then of the city council, but it is just, so what you're actually doing is trying out or experimenting with the technology in a kind of smaller but environment, but this is nevertheless as much as possible like the real world, so to say. So it is not a lab in the sense of lab where you're doing physical trials. It is a lab where you do say and trial with using the technology. And it may require what's called lead users, so users that are willing to use this technology before others. And I think this is particularly relevant for technologies that we're not so sure about what are the potential. And actually, this is true both of the more commercial potential, but also of the way it will be used, and also about what possible societal and ethical issues these might bring. So this drone technology is a particularly good example, because like I said, regulators didn't want to allow these drones in city centers for, in a sense, understandable reasons. But the company argued, well, the risks are actually not that big, and they're doing a kind of trial, for example, allowing it, if a city would be willing to allow it for a month to operate under certain conditions, also conditions of stopping when something was going to stop the experiment. The company could actually show, okay, this works. Or it could be that they found out, okay, there is this unexpected issue. Now we need to address that. So, and that's of course responsible innovation. So, and this also very much makes clear that responsible innovation is not so much about constraining technology. Exactly in this case, it is very much about allowing the technology to be developed, but do it in a responsible way. And actually, by doing it in this way, you might be, like I said, be able to convince the city council to allow such an experiment. So you have the same thing with autonomous cars. It's different in different countries, but there are several countries that allow some form of experimentation. And this is actually also from technical reasons necessary, because otherwise you cannot improve them enough to make them work. So that's the idea of living labs. And very much the idea to do that in a responsible innovation way. Yeah.
Who's doing that really well?
I think countries like Japan are doing this quite good. I think there's some of it in the Netherlands. I think in the United States there's also, although there people from the responsible innovation might have the idea that it allows is a bit too easily allowed, in the sense that so for example, you have a whole discussion. So in the US, for example, for quite some time it was allowed to have autonomous cars, and we had for example, the accident with an Uber. This wouldn't have been allowed in most European countries. So you might say, in a sense, the US is doing this more. But the critical remark you might make there, it is much more from just the point of view of advocating the technology, and not so. And again, so I'm not saying that I'm not against advocating technology. I'm only saying it should be done in a responsible way. I think this combination you find better in countries like Japan and the EU. I think this is only happening on a small scale, but it's interesting. My university, I'm at Delft University, so we have something that's called the Green Village. It's actually just a small area on our campus. And there they organize living labs, and the interesting thing is that because the area is owned by the university, it is private ground, so that means that some of the rules and regulations don't apply to it. So for example, the rules and regulations for traffic don't apply at private ground. So it means that so some people also talk about what they call regulatory free zones. So these are zones in which some regulations don't apply. And again, you can do this in an irresponsible way. You're saying, well, but you can also do it in a responsible way. Namely, it might actually be true that some regulation is not a good regulation in view of a new technology, and that would actually be more responsible. So, and this is the nice thing about this, what is called Green Village, because in a sense it is also to some extent a regulatory free zone. You can try out things you cannot try out in public space. And I think these kinds of environments, and they should of course be done in a responsible way. We should have some ethical guidelines for them. But I think they're really important, on the one hand, to be able to create these technologies, but also because they allow you to see some of the ethical issues on a small scale. And that has a very big advantage, because, I mean, you mentioned the case of social media. So we now have all these problems with echo chambers and problems with truth and so on. So there's a lot of issue about social media. And it might be that they couldn't have been foreseen completely beforehand, but it is interesting to think, suppose we had tried out social media on a smaller scale, in a kind of controlled group, maybe we had found some of these issues and we could have addressed them then, and then it would have been much easier to address them than now that, well, all social media has been organized in a certain way. So this is also very much the idea of these living labs, that you can find some of the things you didn't solve also in an ethical sense quite early on. And this is why I think it is not just an boost for innovation. It is also a boost to do innovation in a responsible way if you organize it properly.
Do you think universities are the ideal places for living labs, given the facility and the environment?
To be honest, I think universities are very well placed, because certainly technical universities like my own, because on the one hand they have the connection to companies, to the technology, but they also have very much this broader social function, and they very much, or should have, this interest, and my university has, and I think many, in doing this responsible. So I think universities are very well placed at this crossroads, so to say, between technology, private interest, but also the public interest. Yeah.
I'm wondering about assessment of the KPIs. What are some of the potential adverse impacts of responsible innovation KPIs and measurements, and how do we avoid those adverse impacts?
Yeah. So let me say first about why I think there is this, you might call it, pitfall. And actually, it is good to say that this is not specific in a sense for KPIs for ROI. It is, I think, a pitfall that happens with any KPI or any performance measure. And I think we all are aware of it, or we all have come across it. So as soon as you make KPIs or performance measures, what's going to happen is that people strategically going to try to meet these performance measures. So my university at some point had a system that your group get more money if you have more publications. And this led to all kind of, even to people splitting up publications. So they're splitting just one publication in two publications, and then you score better in the system. But of course, they haven't become any more productive by splitting they just have strategically adapted to the environment. Now, this danger is always with performance measures. So the danger is that you're actually just trying to meet the performance measure, but you're forgetting about the underlying goal and I think this is even bigger for responsible innovation, because responsible innovation is in a sense very hard to measure, I think. Because responsible innovation, like I already said, it can mean different things for different companies, how you do it best. And then if you have one measure, so for example, if you express responsible innovation in how many scenarios you made, and it has something to do with responsible innovation, because building scenarios help you think about the future, help you to anticipate better. But like I said, small companies might not be able to do that and score very low on that KPI, but they might do responsible innovation on other. And of course, you might have KPIs for other things, but just to point out that scoring low on that KPI doesn't necessarily mean they don't do responsible innovation series. It just means they score low on that KPI. So having said that, I don't think there's anything wrong with having KPIs. I think two things are important. So one thing is that company working with KPI, they should really think good about what KPIs they want to have. And if you go to the PRISMA website, we suggest many possible KPIs, but I think companies really need to attune it to what they want to do. And I think the other thing is that you should use KPIs much more as something that help you to improve and learn than something as an accountability mechanism. So if you use them as an accountability mechanism, you just show them to yourself or to the outside world, well, I'm doing so good. And then there's a very much incentive just to score good on them, even if your underlying process doesn't really represent responsible innovation. But if you use them to improve and to learn, you take them, okay, we wanted to do this, but we didn't achieve this. What went wrong? And it can even involve asking the question, okay, maybe we formulate the KPI in the wrong way because what we want to achieve was something different. So I think you can use KPIs very well, but just more to think critically about yourself rather than as an accountability mechanism. Or maybe, so you'll also want some KPIs for an accountability mechanism. Maybe governments, for example, want that. But then you have very much the danger of strategic behavior. So I think there is a kind of choice there. But I would say, in general, think very deep about which ones you want to have and use them to improve yourself and to learn rather than simply as an accountability mechanism, so to say.
So you touched on this point before.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you, from a company's perspective, what do you think is the biggest challenge for them when they think about applying responsible innovation? Again, I think maybe we've touched on them before. And how can people who do responsible innovation help them to get over those hurdles?
Yeah. So I think the few things that actually kind of vary. So one very straightforward one is that they might lack, or at least might feel they lack, the resources, so money and manpower to do responsible innovation. And for some, responsible innovation activities are quite resource incentive. So there it makes. So I think that might be one thing. Having said that, I think there is still a lot. Even if you don't do the resource intensive things, there's a lot of other things you can do. But I think one thing is you and this is certainly for smaller. This is less an issue, I think, for bigger companies, but certainly for smaller companies, this can be simply a serious issue that don't have the resources or the manpower. And second thing is not so much is more expertise and capabilities. So I think responsible innovation requires some expertise and capabilities that are new to a company, and to do it properly, you might. So big companies might want to hire new people who have these capabilities. Smaller companies might do some consultancy or whatever. But I think it is not just about sheer manpower and money. It is also about expertise and capabilities that they need to acquire. Then the next one is actually has to do with what you already said, things like trust and relationships. So first of all, it requires, of course, in our case, trust with the people like we in our project who want to, but it also, I'm very much noted. So some companies, or maybe many, but at least some companies found it hard to trust the broader audience, or to trust stakeholders, or to trust NGOs. And sometimes they're good, sometimes they're really, so we had a biotech company who really had bad experiences with NGOs and really had hard fights. And to be honest, I think also some dishonest attacks on them. And then the impulse is to shy away from dialogue with these. I don't think that, I understand, but I don't think it is the good thing to do. How difficult. So, but I think for many companies, it still feels of, for example, opening up these dialogues in a real way, not just talking and then doing nothing, but in a real way. Also feels a bit insecure, because it means that others get to say something about what you're doing. It means that you have to be a bit vulnerable, and it can also be that you get criticism you didn't expect or you don't like. So I think this is also really a barrier, because it requires another way of working. I think in the long run it will pay off, but I think this is also hard for many companies. And then the final thing, this is also has also a bit to do with this is and this has to do with responsible innovation is about the innovation process, and it's, of course, it's different for companies, but most companies consider the innovation process and the products they develop really at the core of their business proposition. So they're very much afraid that knowledge comes to other companies, or are they very much afraid of opening up the innovation process because it is so crucially important for them? Which makes perfect sense, of course. I mean, because it is a main asset of them. And I think there is also a barrier that they really feel hesitant there, so they easily open up other activities. So this is one reason why CSR in general is easier than responsible innovation, because responsible innovation is about the innovation process, and many companies feel so. I think here the main point for them to learn is that, like I said, there can be a lot of added value for the innovation process if you open it up. And of course, I mean, I worked also with a company, and they were initially very reluctant. But to be honest, I think nothing what we wanted to do had anything to do with intellectual property rights or things that are really sensitive. It is just more the feeling that they have that it is sensitive than that it is really sensitive, because the things that you want to discuss in terms of responsible innovation are not these trade secrets, so to say. But I think this is also a kind of reluctance because of that, and an understandable reluctance to be, I think, yeah.
Would it help when one starts a responsible innovation project to say, these are the stuff that's off limits? We are not going to be talking about things that are sensitive to your company. And the rest of it is where we will go and have a look at your current processes and help you to improve them. Would that help?
Yeah, I think one of the hopes we had, and this is what we tried with the PRISMA project, having the pilots as a kind of positive examples, showing that other companies did and that they felt it was useful. So just showing them it is not just us telling that this is possible, but there are actually these companies who did so and who feel good about it. So we believe that this would also be important. But I agree, it is. And here, I mean, this also relates very much to the point that you need the commitment of the higher management in the company, because they in the end will make this kind of decisions. And again, I mean, they don't need to open up the innovation process in terms of technological details or whatever, but they need to open up the innovation process in terms of broader societal values and broader societal concerns. And that might feel a bit uneasy for some companies, I think.
I'm wondering, so there are increasingly founders and business leaders who want to give back to the community. So we have the 1% group of people, and then we have, of course, companies who dedicate a portion of their revenue to social good programs. What do you think about these programs versus, well, not versus, but, you know, responsible innovation as a way of doing business?
So I think many of these programs are laudable. I mean, I think it is good to do something for the community, and I think it is good that companies have this responsibility. But to be honest with you, I'm also sometimes a bit skeptical about these programs in the following sense, that sometimes what you see, and of course I'm now making it a bit of a caricature, but sometimes you feel so you have this company who makes a lot of profit in a, say, irresponsible way, and then at the end of the day gives back some of the revenues that they have gained in an irresponsible way to the community. And then I would say, okay, well, it is not bad that they give something back to the community, but it's much more important that they started to do do business and to innovate responsibly from the start. So I'm teaching classes to students about also a class which is about business propositions and how to start about businesses, and I give a course there on corporate social responsibility and a lecture about corporate social responsibility and responsibility. And I'm telling them, well, what you should do is not so much all this kind of charity. I'm not against this charity, but what you really should do is make responsibility part of your business proposition and your proposition to society. And some people call this a shared value. And the idea of shared value is that you're creating a kind of a business proposition which allows you to make profit, which allows you to stay in business, but which also adds something to society, without seeing this as a necessary contradiction between the society good and the business good, but trying to find a proposition that is good for society and for your company. And if you do it that way, it very much means that you probably will develop other products. And I tell the students, I think this is a much better way and a much more structural way to do responsible business and to do responsible innovation than just first to make profit and then to give back to the community. So this is why I have a bit, and again, I mean, I think we shouldn't, there's not a reason to complain that people want to give to the community, but I'm always a bit hesitant and skeptical. And I think, to be honest, if you look some of these very rich people doing so, well, they did businesses about which you can at least face some issues about whether it was completely responsible. Let me phrase it that way.
So it sounds like responsible innovation goes quite well with social enterprise, social businesses. And sometimes though, when you talk to social enterprise founders or people who do dedicate their business to do good, and you talk to them about responsible innovation, you get the response of, I'm already ethical, I'm already responsible, so that should be enough. So what do you think that's enough, or what can responsible innovation offer to them?
Yeah. So first, you're right. And actually, this happens not only with social enterprises, but also with some other companies. So sometimes, indeed, one of the first reactions, if you talk about people about responsible innovation, is they almost see it as a kind of attack. Okay, so what I'm now doing is apparently not responsible. And they're starting to say, yeah, but we're very responsible. I think that is, at least in my view, not the point. And it might indeed be true that they doing, certainly social enterprises are doing things that are motivated by responsibility, and that even if they don't use the term, might be in some sense responsible innovation. So I'm not debating. I think the point is, in a sense, you can always improve. So this is generally true in life, I would say, but it's certainly true. So even if you're doing already some degree of responsible innovation, you can learn to do better, and it can have, certainly for social enterprises who want to do good, it can have a lot of benefits. And to be honest, I mean, responsible innovation is about intentions and about the desire to do good, but it is also about knowledge and competence. And acquiring the knowledge and competence to do responsible innovation, might not something that social enterprises necessarily are able to do. So it might be just competences or skills they have to learn, or they have to hire people with these skills. So I think it is one thing to be committed, and there's another thing in addition that you need, and it's without commitment you get nowhere. So you need the commitment. But the next step is to do it, to have the expertise and to know of the methods and to know of what are also drawbacks of certain methods, what are limitations of methods. So it is also a kind of systematic capability that you have to build up, and I think there. Many social enterprises can still learn a lot, because, to be honest, some just started with and I think sometimes even very nice idea, but sometimes, to be honest, a bit naive in the sense from, okay, if you do it this way, it will be good. But usually it is much more than just having a great idea and do. It can start with that, but also all nitty-gritty details that are important. And there, I think, they can still learn a lot from people knowing a lot about responsible innovation. Yeah.
So I think about this question, and I think it's sort of like if you are in finance or in accounting, you need you can't just think you want to be financially successful and stable. You need the tools, the accountable tools to do that. Same as in marketing, you can't just think, I want to build a really great brand. There are actually tools to help marketers to develop value proposition. So responsible innovation is the same thing. The intention is great. It's the first step, but there are tools that responsible innovation gives you to do that properly, isn't it?
No, I fully agree. I think one reason why people might sometimes be inclined to think differently is that, in a sense, because we all want to be responsible. So in a sense, it would sound strange to us that in order to be responsible, you need you need these special competences. But I think this is just a difference between being responsible in the sense of being committed to certain values or certain moral principles, and being responsible in how you, for example, exercise innovation or how you lead your company. So in order to be committed to principles, perhaps we all able to do that, and we don't maybe need very special training apart from awareness and things like that. But in order to do it in detail in the innovation process really requires expertise. Like you say, for accountancy, you need financial, and for marketing and for technical innovation, for all these things, you need expertise. And this is actually also true if you really want to do all the details of responsible. So really translate this commitment to the good into something you're doing on the ground, so to say, in your company.
I think it's time for me to ask my last question. Time has gone really fast. So I'm wondering, throughout your career, you've learned a lot and run so many projects, and I'm just wondering, what's the most important lesson or message you want to bring about today for colleagues or people who are watching? What's something that they should be aware of?
So So let me also focus a bit, because I did also things that are not so much related to responsible innovation. So, but maybe it relates also to some of the. So for me, it is an important lesson, and so if you want to, and I think this is in a sense also applies, because I'm also doing more theoretical projects which are not so much, but I think something similar. So for me, it is really important, if you do these things, to start, first of all, if you work with other people, starting with the motivations of these people. So we did this with these companies, what is important for them. But I also do it, I also do now a big project, which is mainly a research project. But I try to start also with my research in a project, what find they important. It's not to say that I don't want to achieve certain things, but I really found it important to start what is important for them, what motivates them. And I think motivation is also really important, because if you let people do things for which they're motivated, they achieve much more than. And I think this was also with these companies. I really want to look, what are these companies motivated to do? Because if I can find that, they will do it themselves in the end, not because I tell them, because they want. So I think it is very much to start with the motivation of the people you're working with. And the other thing is to be to formulate then from that a kind of goals or aspirations you want to achieve, which are, say, difficult enough to be a challenge, but attainable enough to reach something. So, and I think this is also true for companies who want to do. But I think it is also true for researchers in my project who just do research. You want to have a kind of aspirations what challenge you, which make you improve over what you're doing. But at the same time, they should not be so idealistic that they completely impossible, because then they only lead to frustration. And I think this is also kind of interest. So this combination of playing into what is important for people and then setting goals, and of course these goals are partly, for example, in the case of responsible, motivated by the framework of responsible innovation, or if I'm doing research project with the overall goal of the project. But yeah, for me that is, I think, a way I like to work, so to say. Yeah.
When you say motivation and improvement, is that on the motivations of the individuals of themselves or the company?
I think in the end both. So I think it starts with individuals because in a sense the company or in a sense cannot act. I mean, it's just the individuals, but you want it to add up to more than just the individuals. So I think it starts with the individual motivations and aspirations. But what you want is that become something they want together and they want for the company, for example, in the case of responsible innovation. So I think it really needs also that, but I personally see that may sometimes more as a kind of next step. So I think the first step is to connect to the motivation and aspirations of the individuals, but from that to build up something common. And that can sometimes be a challenge because the motivations and the aspirations of the individuals do not always necessarily neatly align to something bigger. But I personally very much believe, and there I've also personally very much believe in kind of bottom-up process, in the sense that the overall, of course, there are certain constraints. I mean, also in a company, but also if I do a project or the university, there's certain constraints. Not everything is possible, but within these constraints, I think it is very good to formulate a kind of the bigger mission for also in a bit bottom-up way, so that it aligns with the missions of individuals. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I hope that we can chat again sometime in the future.
Yeah. Thank you. I very much enjoyed.
Thank you.